I just want to welcome everyone to our April Kelsey Museum Flash Talk. This month's Flash Talk is titled Discarded, Discovered, Stolen, and Recovered: The Turbulent Life of a Marble Statuette from Carthage, presented by Elaine Gazda, Kelsey Museum curator and professor emerita. Thank you so much for being with us today, Elaine. I am so excited for this presentation. Um, Following the presentation today, you are welcome to ask questions of Elaine. You can do that by putting that in the Q&A function, and I will read those out to her. Welcome, Elaine. Thank you for being with us today. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you for inviting me to do a flash talk. I'm grateful for the opportunity to present work in progress because I know members of the audience will have good questions and suggestions, and that will help me further my research. But in any case, I hope that what I've done so far you will find engaging, and that if you have questions, if I'm not explaining something clearly enough, that you'll let me know. Well, the title of my talk, as you can see, gives something of a snapshot of what I'm going to talk about. That is to say, different episodes in the life of a statuette that was discovered by the University of Michigan team at Carthage in 1977. And let's see, I have to advance this. I hope you don't mind that I have all my slides on the side, but it's easier for me to figure out when to change the slide and which one is coming next if I see them there. The publication of the season in which this statuette was found is here on the left, edited by John Humphrey, who was the field director. I will say that John Pedley was the director of the project, and that it was conducted under the aegis of a UNESCO-sponsored international campaign to save Carthage. Carthage is, as I will show you, a beautiful site, and it, in the 20th century, was becoming a popular suburb of the city of Tunis, and a lot of villas and houses and commercial establishments were being built and developing this suburb. And of course, in the process, a lot of ruins of Roman and later Punic and Roman and Byzantine Carthage were being destroyed. And so there was this campaign that ultimately involved 18 different teams from different countries. And several of those teams were American teams. And Michigan was fortunate to be able to join in this international effort. What resulted for me in my research was an article in this volume that John Humphrey edited that studied the marble group of Ganymede and the Eagle. And I will explain who Ganymede is in just a moment. And it proved, the article proved to be fairly influential, partly because I, as a young scholar, I was adventurous enough to date the sculpture to the period that normally would be considered early Christian. And most scholars, I'm going to go back so you can see Ganymede as I'm talking. Most scholars would not have considered this statuette to be that late in date, but rather would have thought it to be Antonine or Severan, that is 2nd century CE into the early 3rd century CE. Stylistically, it has many affinities with that period, but there were certain things about this sculpture that made me suspicious of a date that early, and also the archaeological context, which proved to my mind at least, that the statuette must be quite late. And that meant that a lot of subsequent scholarship developed this kind of statue as a kind of genre of late antique, sometimes called late Roman or early Byzantine art history. And so that was a satisfying conclusion. And John Humphrey now wants me to publish a kind of update of my research so that what has happened in the field can be taken account of in relation to the Ganymede statue. So I am in the process of doing that, but I will explain a little about that as I go along. Now, just to orient everyone, here's Tunis and Tunisia. Most of you know already where this is. And Carthage, as I said, is something of a suburb of Tunis. It's a beautiful site. There's this wonderful view across the Gulf that this mountain Bucornine, and it's lush in vegetation, as you can see. So an attractive place to establish your villa. And in fact, the president of Tunisia back in the 1970s had a villa here, and so that his presence attracted, the upper class Tunisians who could afford to live in Carthage. This international campaign identified, or at least signaled, that several of the major archaeological sites where what this picture is. You're looking across this remnant of a harbor. There were two harbors, the military harbor and the commercial harbor, in Punic Carthage, but they remained harbors throughout the history of Carthage. And there's it's called an Admiral's Island in the middle of this circular water basin. And here's a little bit of that island. But you can see how densely modern building has accumulated around the edges. Now, in 1925, Francis Kelsey led an expedition, or he collaborated, he didn't actually dig there, at this site called the Tophet, which was the Punic sanctuary to the god Baal Hamon and his consort Tanit, where famously children were supposedly sacrificed to these gods, infants. And the University of Harvard University and later Chicago excavated here during the same period of the international campaign to save Carthage, and a British team was excavating here. So just to give you an idea of other activities in the area. The site that was assigned to Michigan was in this area, Dermesh. And there was an early Christian basilica here, but also, as I will show you now, I think, here we are again, which already had been under excavation by the Tunisians. So you see this plan showing you the Tunisian trench that was there back when Michigan started, and some other trenches as well. But the area of this field that Michigan was assigned that most affected my research was this house, the so-called House of the Greek Charioteers, named for a mosaic that's at the threshold of this, of this room, which is alternately called the triclinium, the dining room, or just Ecus, which is, a reception room, but a major room that had mosaic pavements, almost altogether destroyed, except for some of the border, acanthus border. And but the charioteers at the starting gates, I'll show you a picture of that later on, gives the house its name and suggests that the owners of the house, this was, by the way, a house that had been thoroughly rebuilt in the early 5th century, so CE, so the period of St. Augustine and other luminaries of that sort. So the very fact that this was a late house, and the fact that Ganymede, the statue, let me see here, here were another plan of the House of the Greek Charioteers. Here you see the position of the charioteer mosaic. Here's the triclinium. And here you see an outline of the cistern that is the water, water storage unit. Actually, two of them that became joined, two Punic cisterns that remained in use for centuries. That this cistern was where the Ganymede was found in 1977. When the team started excavating the cistern, they didn't expect to find, much of interest, and suddenly things started coming to light that indeed were very interesting. So the story of when this was discarded, the first word in my title, became a matter of when did all of the stuff that got thrown into the cistern accumulate, and when did it actually enter the cistern. So there's a long article by Lindley Van in the same volume that I showed you earlier, explaining that, and much discussion about the fragments of the Ganymede statue. There were 17 fragments that were recovered. And here's a view into the cistern, by the way. And here showing Ganymede in the fragments laid out that were all mixed with, pottery sherds and organic remains, bones of food of birds and animals that had been consumed, presumably in that very triclinium. So it wasn't a stratified kind of deposit in the cistern, but there was enough datable material, including coins, to conclude that the material that had accumulated around the 5th century AD. So in other words, or CE, so that in itself tells us that Ganymede was around until that time. And then the further conclusion was that wherever this accumulated refuse pile had been, perhaps the result of cleaning up after the Vandal invasion in 439 CE, that maybe in the 6th century, it seems as if that's the latest possible date, this whole refuse pile was dumped into the cistern. So all the indications were that Ganymede was still there in that period, which helped me to look at stylistic parallels that late. So now what happens next is that the Tunisians allowed the project to send coins and the Ganymede fragments, and I think some other materials as well, to Ann Arbor for restoration, study, and publication, to be returned when the work had been done. And so in 1978, these were laid out on my desk in the Kelsey Museum as I tried to figure out what was going on here. And Amy Rosenberg, our conservator at the time, took charge of reassembling the fragments. But there were some problems because the statue had evidently broken and was restored in antiquity. And the pin, there was an iron pin here in the tree trunk, and another one here in the neck, and a third one in the lower leg of Ganymede. And obviously the pin started to rust and to discolor the marble while the pieces were in the cistern, the damp environment. And you see discoloration here too, and here. But until we knew exactly what was there, the removal of those pins, which seemed advisable so that no further damage would occur, needed to be undertaken very carefully. At the time, in the 1970s, there was a nuclear reactor on North Campus called the Phoenix reactor, and through the good graces of a radiologist at the University Hospital, Ethan Brownstein, we got permission to have Ganymede bombarded with neutrons so that we could see what was going on inside. And here's what we got. You see the pin for Ganymede's leg, what was left of the pin, or the dowel, as we would normally call them, in the tree trunk. And then most interesting was this bent dowel in the neck and chest of Ganymede. So that, that led to another stage of restoration, which was to send this statuette to New York to Robert Haber, who specialized in things like removing iron dowels from marble. And he did the work of removing the dowels and reassembling the statuette without them. And that meant that the head of Ganymede was repositioned. Now, you might not think that's such a big deal, but it really changes the whole relationship between Ganymede, this beautiful Trojan youth who was a shepherd on Mount Ida, according to myth, who was who captivated the Olympian god Zeus, who came down in the form of an eagle, or sent his eagle, but I think this really is Zeus in a form of an eagle. And he took Ganymede up to Olympus for to become the cupbearer of the gods, or in some versions of the myth, his own personal cupbearer. This has many implications, and the relationship and the kind of glances between the eagle and Ganymede proved, I think, to tell the myth, recount the myth in a particular way that I will try to explain in a bit. But I want to finish the the story of what happened while the statue was here, and then when it was sent back to Tunisia. So anyway, this is the first restoration, and you see there's a little gap here, and this is the second. And it made a big difference not to have the head of Ganymede tilted that way. So in the meantime, John Humphrey was, while Ganymede was still here in Ann Arbor, John Humphrey started to build a museum and completed a museum on the site in Dermesh, over one of the cisterns, not of the house of the Greek Charioteers, but next to it. He had Earth Watch volunteers working with him. And this is a detail of the interior of that museum, with a hole in the floor that leads down into one of the cisterns. And they placed Ganymede right here to suggest his archaeological context. So it was a very nice display, a small museum, very site specific, but it was not it was not as secure as a larger museum might have been, although things happen in larger museums. And in 2013, the Ganymede was stolen from this museum, and it was just a tremendous national tragedy in the eyes of the Tunisians, and the press had the story all over it. It was all over the internet. There are many, if you Google Ganymede and Carthage, you'll probably find a lot of press releases, including these. And so it became a kind of symbol of the need for Tunis to or Tunisians to have to safeguard their archaeological heritage and artistic heritage. And Ganymede went from becoming this charming little statuette that came out of a cistern in a Roman house to a national treasure, to a masterpiece, to many other epithets that significantly increased its value in the eyes of the Tunisian public, at least, and possibly the international world. So this was another stage and an important stage in the so-called life of this statuette. Um, the good news is that it was recovered. And you see that that happened in January of 2017. So it was lost, so to speak, for 4 years. And that was, I have to tell you, when I heard about this news, I really felt as if I had lost a child. It was so, so shocking. And I just could not believe that this statuette was gone forever. Fortunately, it wasn't. So it's back. And there's much ado about, restoring it again. Well, here's some news, further news is showing one of the government officials with Ganymede, a little Tunisian flag right here, and then a detail of the statue. But now you see more fragments scattered around. So pieces of the eagle's wing, the dog, some of the little branches up here and so forth have fallen away in the course of this theft. It was determined that guards at the museum two guards had stolen this piece. And through the work of the Tunisian police and Interpol, this was recovered. So it wasn't, it's a sad story, but only happily has a good ending. And here we have a very sort of official transfer of the statue from the back to the minister of culture. So it's you can see that this really gives you a good sense of the scale. Of course, it's very delicate and small statue. Okay, so my current research, and I'm over my 15 minutes already, but I'll try to do this quickly. Is to try to assist with restoring the statuette and with making a replica. I've been conferring with Carrie and Suzanne about materials that might be appropriate for both projects, and we're in the process of getting permission from the Tunisian authorities for me to go to Tunisia perhaps next month and work on this restoration and making of a replica. In the course of doing that, I'm hoping, although I have absolutely no guarantee of being able to do this, I'm hoping to be able to get a couple of samples of the marble because we did analyze the marble back in the late 70s, and but the only test that was run was neutron activation, and the kinds of tests that are being done now on marble are more extensive and more accurate, and so it would help us to be able to place Ganymede in his place of manufacture, so to speak. And so that would be interesting for art history students. And then my article, this that I'm writing now, assesses the influence that the Ganymede has had in scholarship on late antique mythological statuettes since 1981. And I'm very happy to say that one of our archaeology PhDs, Leah Sterling, who's at the University of Manitoba, did a dissertation on similar statuettes and really established the genre of these late mythological statuettes, as they have come to be called, in the repertoire of late antique art. And she's had a lot of recognition for this, and many other scholars, well, in my opinion, many, maybe not so many, but the few that to study late antique art specifically have continued that work and enlarged the corpus even further. So that's very exciting. Then I want to move on to the interpretation of the statuette As I said, it was found here. Well, this was the end of the cistern where it was deposited. So very close to the triclinium. That doesn't prove that it came from the triclinium, but it makes it hard to think of any other place where it might have come from. I mean, hauling it across town in fragments with a lot of kitchen refuse doesn't make much sense. So, and this being a dining room, the kitchen probably off here, this would be a perfect place to clean up your zone after vandals invaded. Now, this is the Charioteers mosaic. I want to point out that these are labeled in Greek, and that's unusual. But it's clear that the people who owned this house were fans of the races, and that kind of sets a tone for the taste of for something like a mythological statuette. I'm not going to try to prove anything further of that connection right now, but I'll write about it in my article. Just looking, I want to show you a series of images of the Ganymede, different points of view, so that you get the sense of the relationship. Now, in this period in Carthage, it was quite possible that Ganymede had a Christian valence, in that this was a kind of, you might think of it as an apotheosis, except that he doesn't turn into a god when he goes to Olympus, but he goes to heaven to be the cupbearer of the deity, the supreme deity, and perhaps the other gods. And so you can make what you will of that in Christian terms. It's I think far more likely that this portrayal is meant to evoke the more pagan aspect of the myth and its relationship to the practice in Greek, derived from Greek education, which we know as paideia, of young boys or adolescents as lovers of the adult male, and what we would call pederasty today. But this was a socially acceptable thing, kind of part of the maturing of young boys. And so it seems to me that we're looking at something like this. I just want to say that the back of the statue is unfinished. It's very thin. And so it was meant to be displayed in a shallow niche, but as you noticed, it's very portable. One person can hold it very comfortably. So at a dinner party, after dinner, there was the drinking party, the symposium. And you had the cupbearers, the little slave boys, who were serving wine to the guests. And guests were, reciting poetry, they were discussing various matters. And I think it's quite possible that the Ganymede was brought out of its cupboard or its niche. There were two areas in the triclinium where it could have been stored. And depending on where you were lying down on your couch, whether it was the triclinium arrangement of the three separate couches, or the later type of arrangement, this tabadium, the sort of semicircular couch, you were all in fixed positions. And you would have been looking at the Ganymede from different angles. So from this angle, you see one aspect of the statue. From this angle, you see another. I'll bring you up a little closer. And you see that there's just direct eye contact. And what amuses me is that the expressions on the face seem to change as you move around. Here's the eagle. Over here, he looks somewhat menacing. Over here, he looks positively love-struck. And even here, he's looking more so. This is before the head was reset, as you can see. At the bottom of the statue, we have not a sheep. Ganymede was supposed to be a princely shepherd, but rather a goat. And goats were known as the most libidinous of animals. And the mere substitution of the goat for a sheep tells you something about the meaning of this statue. So I'm working on the assumption that this was viewed in a very active way in the course of a dinner party or symposium following the dinner, and that that we can derive further layers of meaning. I suggested some of this in my original article, but I want to follow up and take into account more recent theories of art history, the various developments in late antique art, but things like gender and sexuality, and object agency and so forth, in trying to draw out further layers of meaning of the statuette, because although it's been prominent in the literature on late antique statuettes of this kind, the statuette itself hasn't been looked at again in great detail, and I would like to revisit it and make something of a contribution, I hope, to the ongoing study of this kind of so-called pagan statuary in the early Christian period. So thank you.
Thank you, Elaine, for a very thoughtful presentation today. I would like to now open up the Flash Talk to our guests. Please feel free to put your questions in the question and answer button, and I will go ahead and read those out to Elaine. And while we're waiting on that, I had a question. Elaine, what do you hope to garner if you're able to take and analyze a piece of the marble? What are you hoping the results will, impart to our students?
Well, knowing the source of the marble would help us understand the location of the workshop, because mostly this kind of sculpture would have been produced at the quarry, possibly finished on arrival at its destination, but at least roughed out in a quarry. And there's a lot of interest in the field right now about which quarries were active and what they were producing. Aphrodisias, which is a site well known to those of us at Michigan, as with Chris Rette's affiliation with the site and some of our graduate students as well. Aphrodisias has been claimed to be the source of the marble of the Ganymede, a new quarry that was opened not too long ago. Greek Charioteers produces very fine grained white marble. But without the actual analysis, we can't tell. And the scholars who have most recently published about this have literally cited my verbal description of this marble in attributing it to Greek Charioteers. Well, that's not good enough. And they know it's not good enough. And they say right in their article, this needs to be analyzed again, so that I would just like to straighten out that that part of the story and get a better understanding of where these things were made. I think stylistically, the Ganymede is very closely related to the imperial art of Constantinople in the Theodosian period. And it would also kind of help us to understand where the artists were coming from and what kind of valence that merely executing something in the style of the court, what that would tell us, or might tell us about the significance of this piece.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So as of now, we don't have any questions. I'll leave it open for a little bit longer. I encourage you to go ahead and put questions in the question and answer section. But Elaine, when do you hope to have sort of a final publication available? Is this many years or?
Well, at the rate I'm going. well, no, John Humphrey asked me to write this article, and he's eager to publish the final volume of the excavations of the 1970s. There's some finds that hadn't been published before. And so I guess sooner than later is the answer. But now that there's the possibility of going to Carthage and get even the maybe not so good chance of getting marble analysis, that might hold things up. Because I think it wouldn't make sense to get the marble analyzed after my article gets published. It should be part of it. But John Humphrey might have a different opinion. We'll see. Yeah, but relatively soon, in other words, probably in a year's time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I do have one question from a current docent, Doug White, and he asks, what avenues are you exploring for the possibility of having a replica made?
Oh, very good question, because that is part of what the Tunisians plan to do. At the moment, they've asked about silicone that I might bring with me when I come to Carthage. Carrie and Suzanne have suggested 3D digital, imaging to produce a model, which would be a lot less intrusive and probably more, I don't know exactly how the final product, whether it would be 3D printing, I assume it would be 3D printing, whether that would be possible in an object for the object this size, whether we have the equipment or whether the Tunisians do. But those are, making a silicone mold and possibly cast or a digital print are the two things that we thought about so far.
Thank you.
If you have any suggestions, please let me know.
Absolutely. We have another question from Pat Pancioli, one of our current docents. So Elaine, can you comment on the meaning of Zeus as an abductor and lover of so many mortals, including Ganymede?
Can I comment on it? Well, I don't know what to say other than he, as a supreme Olympian god, he certainly had a wide range of affiliations with different mythological figures, and I mean I don't, other than possibly being a kind of role model. I can't imagine exactly what I mean by that, but kind of a role model for social interaction, or if Zeus is participating in this kind of activity, is it okay for everybody else? That I really don't know enough about. Whether there's been a lot of discussion of that and by scholars. I'm sorry, I'm not as well informed as I perhaps should be, but I'll think about that.
That's great. Thank you so much. So as of right now, we have another question coming in from a guest, Catherine Love. What do you hope to add to your analysis by including recent studies on gender and sexuality?
Well, I think that there's so much more interest in that subject now than there was back in 1981, and so much more work that's been done, that I think it would be possible to situate this statuette more firmly in relation to the culture of Paideia in Carthage of this period, which was really, the period of St. Augustine. Church fathers were writing about the loves of Zeus as, just using that motif, so to speak, to condemn the Olympian gods and to promote Christianity and Christian values. They didn't like people going to the races either, or to the theater, or where they're performing plays that entailed the lives of the figures of myth, including Ganymede. And so I think by just developing this culture, a picture of this culture that I was only able to allude to briefly in my first article, that might add further value and interest to this particular statue, but also the genre that it belongs to in this period. Because people don't quite know what to do with it other than to say, well, it shows that if you were educated in the Greek way, that you were exposed to the myths, you knew them all, you valued the classical tradition, classical style and art was something also to be valued, and that's all true. But I think to zero in on one particular statue and its cultural, archaeological, social context, and try to pull out some of the nuances of the encounter that we see here I think it would be of greater interest in the long run. I think it kind of disappears into the article that I wrote before. It's just a kind of footnote.
Great, thank you. Elaine, we have more of a comment from one of our docents, Dave Horrocks. He says, I saw the Ganymede at the Kelsey shortly after moving to Ann Arbor. I've always remembered it, and thank you. It introduced me to the Kelsey and a long relationship.
Oh, wonderful. That was a long time ago.
Let's see. We have just a comment here from Doug White. There are many new techniques being developed for making of replicas. I might recommend contacting the National Sculpture Society in New York for possible resources. So that's an option as well.
Thank you. That's a very good suggestion.
Well, wonderful. I want to thank everyone today for attending our flash talk. We so appreciate all of you, and especially Elaine for presenting your current research. Thank you so much for being with us today. It was such a pleasure, and I hope we can have you back as a potential follow-up once you learn more here.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to present, and I appreciate having an audience and all the questions that you've asked. Please feel free to email me if you have further thoughts, and I will get back to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone, and feel free to check our website at the Kelsey Museum for subsequent upcoming events. And hope everyone has a great weekend. Thank you so much.